fantasy, sentimentality, drama, and wombats. Might this be the legacy of the Pre-Raphaelites? But before we can reflect on the heritage of Britain's first modern art movement, let me first actually explain what it is, and to explain what it is, I first must set the scene. The year is 1848. Revolutions sweep across continental Europe, the Chartists unsettle Britain, and the Industrial Revolution has already changed everything. Britain is now the world's dominant colonial power, and as its power continues to grow, many of its people suffer. 10% of the British urban population now live in a state of desperation, lacking the food they need to maintain basic physical function. Hunger and poverty are common aspects of life across the UK in the Victorian era. The Royal Academy of Arts was founded 80 years before to establish a school or academy of design for the use of students in the arts, including an annual exhibition. Its president was painter Sir Joshua Reynolds, who in his own practice promoted the grand style of painting, aka the idealization of the imperfect, and that the role of an artist is to make their subject appear as noble as possible. And going back to 80 years later, this was mostly still the case. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, later known simply as the Pre-Raphaelites, was founded in 1848 by 7 English artists who sought to revolutionize art. Their names were William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, his brother William Michael Rossetti, James Collinson, Frederick George Stevens, and Thomas Woolner. At its inception, the Brotherhood strove to inspire artistic renewal and moral reform, and thought of the Royal Academy's view on art to be stale, inaccurate, and outdated. They even referred to Sir Joshua Reynolds as Sir Sloshua, which is basically a way of saying that he was too conventional. This group was particularly inspired by Italian Renaissance art and rejected the 19th century, more academic teaching of art as it was promoted by the Royal Academy. And while the RA adored Raphael, who they considered to be the best thing to come out of the 15th century, our boys thought that maybe, just maybe, that's when people started taking the wrong approach to art. Hence, they were named the Pre-Raphaelites. Though the Brotherhood was a fairly loose association, their paintings were marked with the initials PRB to signify their commitment, and thus a secret society was born. According to William Michael Rossetti, the Brotherhood's early doctrines were expressed in 4 declarations: to have genuine ideas to impress, to study nature attentively, to sympathize with what is direct and serious and heartfelt in previous art, to the exclusion of what is conventional and self-parading and learnt by rote, and, most indispensable of all, to produce thoroughly good pictures. They were fascinated by medieval culture, which somewhat clashed with that principle of realism and observation of nature. As the movement progressed, there was kind of a split between realism and medievalism, but more on that later. So from the initial 7 members of the Brotherhood, I'm going to get into the 3 most popular ones, starting with the child prodigy, perhaps the most mentally stable member of this group, John Everett Millais. Aged 11, he became the youngest student to enter the Royal Academy schools. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was actually founded at his family home in London, and his painting, Christ at the House of His Parents, became so controversial that Charles Dickens described it as hideous. Despite generating much controversy, he produced what is maybe the most famous Pre-Raphaelite painting, Ophelia. The model for that was the Pre-Raphaelite muse and artist Elizabeth Siddal, who posed fully clothed in a bathtub, and despite Millais placing oil lamps under the tub to warm up the water, she became so seriously ill from the cold that her father actually sent Millais a letter requesting £50 for medical expenses. Millais eventually moved away from the Pre-Raphaelites to more realism in his work, and thus became enormously successful and very wealthy. Another bit of controversy that he was involved in is actually his marriage to Effie Gray, who was formerly married to the art critic John Ruskin, who was disgusted by Effie's body, and thus the marriage was never consummated. She ran away from her husband back to her family. Anyway, telling you the whole story would probably require another video essay. But yeah, Effie and John got married and had lots of babies and lived very happy, successful lives. And overall, I think John Everett Millais sounds lovely. The second Pre-Raphaelite baddie that we're going to be talking about is actually William Holman Hunt. Born into a working-class family in London, Hunt was actually rejected by the Royal Academy and only succeeded in his second go. The art press called his work clumsy, ugly, but he was actually the most pious member of the Brotherhood, and he was the only member who actually continued to paint religious subjects after the others had mostly moved on. During his career, he actually most often resided outside of England. He owned a house in Jerusalem, and he travelled to places like Palestine, Egypt, and Syria, many times in order to portray his paintings with biblical themes more accurately. His love life was a bit of a mess, with him first getting romantically entangled with his muse, the Chelsea barmaid Annie Miller. Miller was the subject of his 1853 painting The Awakening Conscience, and Hunt actually planned to marry her. He'd made arrangements for her to be educated while he was away in Palestine, and left her with a list of artists, for example Millais, for whom she could sit. But, as we'll find out very soon, she sat for Playboy Rossetti. And when Hunt returned, he felt absolutely betrayed by both his girlfriend and his friend. Later, he married a woman called Fanny Vall, and after she died in childbirth, he actually married her younger sister, which is actually not as bad as what our other pre-Raphaelite baddie did. Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Born in London to an Italian family, he was actually given the name Gabriel Charles Dante Rossetti, but then he changed the order of his name to emphasize his Italian heritage and his personal connection to the poet Dante. But his friends mostly called him Gabriel. He was the brother of the poet Christina Rossetti, author Maria Francesca Rossetti, and fellow Pre-Raphaelite founding member William Michael Rossetti, who, despite being the youngest member of the family, was actually the most responsible member of his family, which is great. Rossetti was ambitious and charismatic, but also extremely reckless. He first studied art at a drawing academy and then at the RA, followed by private lessons with Ford Madox Brown. Rossetti sought out Holman Hunt's friendship after seeing his work, and then together with Millais and all of the others, they developed the core philosophy of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Rossetti was always more interested in the medieval side of the movement, translating Dante and other medieval poets into English and following the stylistic characteristics of the early Italians. Oh, and do you remember the girl who nearly froze to death in Millais' bathtub? That was Elizabeth Siddal, or Lizzie, who became Rossetti's muse, pupil, and on and off girlfriend, and later his wife. Again, this would be a terribly long story to get into properly, but Rossetti did not treat her right at all. They were married in 1860, but she died likely of suicide in 1862, and when Lizzie was buried at Highgate Cemetery, he interred many of his poems with her, though he later had her dug up so he could get them back. Basically, he didn't go there with a shovel and do that himself. Instead, with the help of the worst man in London, who was Charles Augustus Howell, he secured two men attending Highgate Cemetery to open and close the coffin. Howell was actually the one who placed that idea into Rossetti's head of exhuming Lizzie's body. But what I would like to know is, how did he bury all of his poems with his dead wife and not just make any copies? Apparently, Howell told Rossetti that Lizzie's body was perfect, still, after all these years, and her long hair was even more voluptuous than it had been before. And of course, he had the manuscript, which was actually rotten, had holes in it, and had to be handed over to a doctor in Kennington for drying and disinfecting. But why did Howell lie to Rossetti about this? He was feeding into Rossetti's delusions. There was a pre-Raphaelite notion that tragedy was linked to beauty and tragedy with appeal. Rossetti was not without admirers, though. His visions of Arthurian romance and medieval design inspired two young Oxford graduates, William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones, and together they worked on the murals of the Oxford Union Library building. And there they met the young Jane Burden, who they used as their model. At this time, Morris fell in love with Jane, and they became engaged and later married, but she was more attracted to Rossetti and actually admitted that she was not at all in love with Morris. However, later on, as you might expect from Rossetti, Rossetti and Janie did have a multi-year affair, both behind Morris's back and also with his consent. It's a very sad story. Rossetti rarely exhibited his art, as he was particularly sensitive to criticism. Regardless, he sold much of his work privately to relative success. He lived in Chelsea for over 20 years and kept a menagerie of exotic animals and birds in his Tudor house. He particularly was fascinated by wombats, spending hours and hours observing them in the London Zoo and even writing poetry about them. His first wombat, Top, often slept on the dinner table during meals, and according to many sources, he would carry it burrowed between his coat and his waistcoat. Rossetti also allegedly owned a llama, armadillos, monkeys, kangaroos, peacocks, raccoons, and many more, but he was a fairly irresponsible pet owner, and let's say did not end very well. Rossetti struggled with many health issues, including addiction and mental illness, and he died of kidney disease in 1882. So what happened next? As you might expect, the 7 original members of the PRB were not the only Pre-Raphaelites. William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones were actually followers of the same principles, and as the second and third generations of the movement progressed, more artists continued to follow the Pre-Raphaelite legacy. Maurice Bartali Stillman, the Greek model and artist, Arthur Hughes, John William Waterhouse, Evelyn de Morgan, Frederick Sandys, Lawrence Alma Tadema, Frederick Leighton, and so many more. Many scholars argue that the works of Edward Burne-Jones and the Pre-Raphaelites strongly influenced J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and was influenced by the same mythological scenes portrayed by the Pre-Raphaelites. Tolkien actually considered his own group of school friends as a group in the same vein as the Pre-Raphaelites. But as 20th century artistic ideals began to shift, art no longer represented reality. Pre-Raphaelite art was significantly devalued and commonly thought as tacky or lacking any real meaning. It wasn't until the 1960s when Pre-Raphaelitism experienced a renewed public interest and their legacy was re-examined. Today, they're a bit like Marmite, I think. You either love them or hate them. I love them. What did the Pre-Raphaelites actually stand for? Edward Burne-Jones took the movement in a new direction. A medievalist realm of Arthurian knights and auburn-haired maidens, he sought to re-enchant a world that he felt had been sullied physically by the Industrial Revolution and the unchecked capitalism of the British Empire. He thought that art should not capture modern existence, but instead offer an escape from it. I mean, by a picture, he said, a beautiful romantic dream of something that never was, never will be. As the movement progressed, more and more women took center stage in it, not just as muses and models, but as active participants. Lucy Maddox Brown, Evelyn de Morgan, and of course Maurice Bartali Stillman, who went from posing for Rossetti and Ford Maddox Brown to having an international career that spanned 6 decades, with her masterful work that is equal to, and in many cases superior to, many of the official members of the Brotherhood. Most of the women were what we would call bohemian, and they came up with the aesthetic dress movement in an effort to brighten up rigid Victorian fashion. Many, like Jane Morris, rejected corsets and wore loosely cut dresses, and of course, they were an essential part of the arts and crafts movement, which grew from similar views and ideals. And there were also artists such as Simeon Solomon, another prodigy and integral figure to the movement, who is hardly known today, primarily because of his sexuality. When in his mid-30s and at the peak of his career in 1873, Solomon was actually arrested after being caught in a sexual act with another man. This was illegal at the time, and he was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment and labour. Ultimately, that was changed to a fine of £100, but Solomon's reputation and career never recovered. His high-profile friends, like Rossetti or the poet Algernon Swinburne, all turned their backs to him, and Solomon lived more than 30 years after his arrest, destitute and homeless, and died in 1905 in a Holborn workhouse. The Pre-Raphaelite Renaissance in the 1960s was due to the fact that Pre-Raphaelite artists were seen as countercultural rebels. Even today, people like myself still relate to how Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris rejected capitalism and criticized the Industrial Revolution. And I would go as far as to say that that is a big part of their enduring popularity. I don't want to live in a world where artificial intelligence steals people's livelihoods, destroys the planet, and makes us give up our essence of humanity. And if I can live with the same ideals as these beloved Victorian radicals, then I suppose I'll be happy. For me, the Pre-Raphaelites inspire me to dream of a less materialistic world. And as Burne-Jones once said to Oscar Wilde, the more materialistic science becomes, the more angels I shall paint. Their wings are my protest in favour of the immortality of the soul. If you're interested in a very revolutionary Pre-Raphaelite inspired project, check out my upcoming short film, The Three Graces, which I've co-created, written, I'm acting in, and I'm co-producing. It's about these 3 Greek female artists who shake up the London 1860s art scene as they pursue their artistic careers alongside the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. We're filming it this August, following our successful Kickstarter campaign, where we raised over £7,000, but filmmaking is very expensive. And if you enjoyed this video and the prospect of the 3 Graces, you can still donate to the project if you wish to support us, or you can follow us on Instagram at the 3 Graces Film. Thank you, and I'll see you very soon.